It's so lovely to sit down with you to talk about Bunny Mellon. Some of you, I imagine, know a little bit about her and find her really, really fascinating, and potentially you may be obsessed with her slightly in the same way I am. And I mean, you know, born into immense wealth, married into immense wealth, exacting eye, perfectionist, impeccable style across the board, friends with all the people that were, you know, so many very private people that she became so close with, genuinely close with, mercurial, complex, you know, prolific shopper and collector. Did you become fascinated and obsessed with her? You know, would you walk us through kind of how this came about? Because I think it's such a great story.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you all for coming on a beautiful Friday morning. This was an unusual experience for me in terms of working on this book. It was my third I've now done 4 books. And what happened was Newsweek called me in 2011 and asked me to write about Bunny Mellon. Now, as you may remember, she was involved at that point with the John Edwards scandal. John Edwards ran for president, and he had, turned out he had a mistress and a girlfriend, and he was indicted for campaign finance violations for accepting a lot of money for his campaign that he then used to support his wife and daughter. And Bunny Mellon had given him a ton of money because she thought he was the next JFK. So at the point when I didn't know that much about her. I knew she was Jackie Kennedy's best friend. I knew she had designed the White House Rose Garden. I knew she was considered to be very, very private, but had amazing taste. So when they asked me to do a story, I said, you know, she never talks, but I'll try. And you know, when you're trying to reach someone who, I think she was about 100 at that point, you know. So, you know, you don't call them, you don't email them, you don't text them. I had, which I'm sure Elizabeth has as well, beautiful monogram stationery. So I wrote her a note on monogram stationery, and I mentioned I had done one of the first stories on John Edwards when he was considering running for president. So I mentioned in my note that I had known him, and before his life blew apart, I'd actually thought he might have been a good president. So I didn't think I'd hear back. And one day the phone rang, and there was this little tiny voice on the phone. It was Bunny Mellon. And she said, "You wrote me such a nice note that I thought I would call you to say, I'm not going to talk to you." And then she talked. And then I was asking her questions, and she was answering. We were having this really lovely conversation, and I thought, okay, I got my interview. And after I spoke to her, I began to try to reach other people. Her lawyer, Alex Forger, who had also been Jackie Kennedy's lawyer, her grandson, Thomas Lloyd, one of her closest friends, Brian Huffman. And she felt comfortable enough with me that she basically told people that they could ignore their NDAs and speak to me. And mind you, this is a point when helicopters are buzzing her house, the FBI is interviewing her, so she talks to me. So the piece came out, and she was happy with it. And I woke up I think the piece was over the summer, I woke up on Thanksgiving morning, and I thought, how many 101-year-olds do I know? None. So I called her up just to wish her a happy Thanksgiving, and she was incredibly touched. We had a lovely conversation on the phone, talked about a few more things. And then that was kind of it. But I had gotten to know some of the people in her life, and I stayed in touch. And when she died, I got a call before it was on the wires, and I got invited to her funeral, which was at the unbelievably gorgeous Oak Spring Farm. My husband decided he would accompany me. He said he would pretend to be the chauffeur. He'd wear a chauffeur's hat, you know. And if I had been interested before, I was riveted afterwards because the speeches that people gave, Bette Midler came and sang The Rose, John Edwards came, and Bunny's stepson, Timothy Mellon, was so angry he wouldn't let him in the church. I mean, there was a whole scene. It was just so much drama. And afterwards, there was this beautiful reception. Bunny was one of those people who had planned her funeral years in advance. She picked out the ushers, the food that would be served, the tablecloths. And at that reception, her grandson, Thomas Lloyd, said, "We'd like you to write the book. There's going to be a book. She liked you. We'd like you to write it." And he and his brother and other family members were unbelievably candid in saying, "We love Bunny, but she was a very difficult woman in many ways. Write what you find." That was a huge gift to me because I didn't feel like I had to. I felt like, okay, I can just research and write. And this is a woman who saved everything. I mean, I'm talking, she was very close to Givenchy. There were 5 boxes of Givenchy notes to her. Every time her husband gave her a painting, and he gave her a lot, he would write a little rhyming note. They were all there. Every garden receipt. So I was able to spend a lot of time at Oak Spring Farm just reading and reading and reading. Her husband's war letters were there. So it was really an interesting way to learn about somebody. There were also indications to me that, you know, there were letters from people like Kenneth, the famous hairdresser, saying, you know, "Bunny, I love you. I hope that nothing ever, you know, brings us apart. But please, if there's ever a problem, tell me. Don't just drop me," because she did it all the time. And she did it with him too eventually. So you could sort of see that there was a lot of complicated stuff going on. So let me go back to Elizabeth.
Absolutely, and I think that this book is, guys, it's so fabulous because the complexity of her character, and it's so intoxicating just because so many moments in her life are fabulous. They're just so magical and fabulous, and I'd love, actually, if we could start with the Rose Garden in her life, which is such a pivotal moment when, you know, the president comes. You know, and you know, Jackie and JFK, you know, they would come and often visit her at her home in Nantucket, correct?
No, in Cape Cod.
In Cape Cod.
They would take a boat over.
They would take a boat over, and she, you know, the most fabulous grand estate, and meanwhile she'd take them to the little beach shack, you know, with a little basket of food, you know, and they just eat, you know, just by the beach, and so casual. So this real juxtaposition, which she was so famous for, of kind of immense wealth and you know, lavishness, but actually like within that, just total and utter simplicity, which I think these type of people loved and relished about her. Well, will you just walk us through that day and kind of how that came about? Because it's the Rose Garden.
Let me roll back for 2 seconds. Bunny met Jackie through Adele Astaire, the sister of Fred Astaire, who was then living in Virginia, and Adele thought they would like each other. And Jackie went to Bunny's house, and Bunny was famous for what we call shabby chic. You know, unbelievable $1 million paintings, but frayed, you know, chintz. And after Jackie came home, she sent a note to Bunny saying, "I loved your house, I hate mine, will you come help me?" And that was the beginning of their friendship. And I was very lucky in that Bunny thought about writing an autobiography, so she would write down on little scraps of paper things that she was feeling and thinking. And at the point when I went to the library, everything is now cataloged, but it wasn't. And I'm thinking, how am I going to describe the Rose Garden, one of the most famous in history? What do I say about it? And then I think it was maybe it was back on the back of a gardening, whatever it was, Bunny had written about this day. And she described how she was sitting in her bed up at Cape Cod, and she could hear the cook in the kitchen making corn soup, which was JFK's favorite. And she was looking out, it's a beautiful view of the water, and Jackie calls. And Jackie basically says, you know, "I'm about to go to church. Jack's going to ask you something today. You have to say yes." And Bunny said, "What is it?" And Jackie said, "He's going to ask you to design a garden in the White House. Gotta go." And Bunny said, was like completely looked out the window, didn't really know. She had been very close to her maternal grandfather, Arthur Lowe, who was the mayor of Fitchburg, Massachusetts, was a gingham manufacturer, and very patriotic. And her grandfather had always said, if you ever get asked to do anything, you should, for your country, you should do it. And Bunny had not been allowed by her father to go to college. She would have loved to have been, you know, landscape architect, scene designer, or something. So she didn't know about drainage and sewers and all the things you might have to know to design a White House rose garden. But she decided she would say yes. And that's how it all kind of began. And she did find someone, Perry Wheeler, who was a very famous, had gone to Harvard, and they worked closely together.
And this relationship with the Kennedys, which I would love for you to touch more on because it's really beautiful and fascinating. But she continued to, she didn't have to work obviously, but she continued, when a funeral would happen, she would provide the flowers, which sounds simple, but imagine millions of people sending flowers, and whose flowers go on the casket, and how do you navigate something that's the visual of a nation mourning. So. Will you tell us more about that friendship?
I mean, it's interesting because they were both very private women, and I think they both had questions about who can you trust. When I interviewed Lee Radziwill, Jackie's sister, I said, what was that relationship like? Because Bunny was 19 years older. Was it mother-daughter? Was it? And Lee said, Lee being Jackie's sister, she said they were more like sisters. They had the same sensibility. Caroline Kennedy wrote a wonderful little essay that she let me use in the book, which she'd written when Bunny died. But it was really all about they were like twins. They had a special language. They were so close. And they were always giving each other gifts. Mind you, Bunny had a lot more money to give, give Jackie gifts. And Bunny was so obsessed with presentation that she wanted to give Jackie a pair of earrings from Tiffany's, and she spent a day searching the beaches of Cape Cod to find the perfect shell that she could put the earrings in, that she could then wrap up. Presentation was all. So they were very closely in touch. And during the, Kennedy's time in office, Bunny essentially became, for free, the kind of decorator in chief. She brought flowers up for parties. She brought, she lent all sorts of materials. There was this incredibly touching note that. From Jackie to her saying, Bunny, you work so hard, you're always behind the scenes, and it was almost like, please don't leave me. I know this is hard on you, but I love you and please don't leave me. When JFK was assassinated, Bunny was in Antigua, which is where she had a weekend home. She came up and saw Jackie in the White House, and Jackie asked her to sort of handle the flowers for the funeral, and that meant, organizing, the casket, whatever, looking at where things were going to be in Arlington Cemetery, and making everything look beautiful. And again throughout their lives, whenever Jackie had a question about how things should look or be, she would ask Bunny. So when Robert Kennedy was assassinated, Bunny did the flowers and some of the things for him. For the JFK Library in Boston, Bunny was involved with the landscaping. But mostly they were just best girlfriends. I mean, after Jackie moved to New York, she would often fly down to spend a weekend with Bunny, ride horses. So they were very close.
And I know that, and once again, that kind of, these two very, very private, but public figures really found solace in each other. But I know even when she would come to visit Bunny, didn't Bunny have a kind of separate little simple cottage, away from the fancy house in Virginia where the two of them could go and, light a fire and just be cozy? Like there was always this kind of coziness within the grandness that I think she just knew innately needed to be part of their friendship, but funded, obviously, by Paul Mellon, husband number two, and I think also he sometimes felt a bit annoyed about their friendship. Would that be correct? Can you just tell us a little bit about that?
All right, let me roll back 2 seconds to say, on Bunny's home in Oak Spring, there are many. Paul Mellon bought up hundreds of acres, so there were many little houses. So there was a log cabin that Jackie would stay in. But Bunny and Paul built this enormous house in Cape Cod. And then Bunny decided she wanted like a separate house. She could go over there for the small little, perfectly, the perfect art, the perfect whatever. And that's where Jackie would stay. And as I was telling Elizabeth, when you're writing a book, the biggest fear, when you're going to take time to do research, is that at some point your people will cut you off. They suddenly will just decide they don't want to do this anymore, and it's like, oh my God. So there was a period in which I had not talked to, excuse me, Bunny's grandson, Thomas Lloyd, and I thought, oh gosh, I hope I don't have a problem. And I was riding in a cab and the phone rang, and it was Thomas, and he said, my wife and I and kids are going to Cape Cod for the weekend, and we're staying in the big house would you like to stay in Bunny's little house? The little house that she used to put Jackie up. And I was like, yes, I would very much like to come. And he said, I could arrange for the housekeeper and the gardeners and everybody to come by and you could interview them. I said, oh yeah, I think that would be really great. Paul Mellon really liked Jackie, but Bunny indulged her in a way that kind of drove Paul a little nuts, in that Paul owned many private planes, always one after another, and when Jackie was building her house in Martha's Vineyard, Bunny was flying materials, fabrics, and Paul was looking at that it cost more to run the plane over there than it did to do the fabric. So there was a kind of a point where he was like, really? Do we have to, Jackie forgot her hat and you want to send a plane for the hat? So.
And that I know you want to do a slideshow, which.
Is this a good time to do it, or do you want to?
Up to you.
Sure. Let me just show you. This is kind of fun. All the little sketches. Bunny and Jackie took drawing lessons, and I filmed, and Bunny would doodle on every letter she sent. So after I was looking at the archive, I asked whether I could use some of these sketches in the book. So if you see little sketches like biography, these are some of her sketches, which are just kind of whimsical and lovely. This is little Bunny, and born in 1910 in Manhattan. This is her grandfather, Arthur Lowe, and Bunny was the oldest of three, and she always said that her mother loved her brother more. Her brother was sickly as a child, and her father loved her. She had a younger sister, who you'll see in a few minutes, who was gorgeous. And Bunny always felt like the odd one out in her family. But her grandfather adored her. So as a young child, he would take her up to his weekend place in New Hampshire. They would sleep under the stars. He would have her pumping water. He taught her about nature and flowers, and she began to have a garden. So he was always an important figure in her life. Now, this is Bunny getting her hair cut. Her father built this enormous place called Albemarle in Princeton, which still exists as part of Princeton, but that's part of the estate, gardens. That's the house as well. Her father, her paternal grandfather founded Listerine. And then her father was an advertising genius who took it from being an antiseptic to being a mouthwash, which was considered déclassé, but they made a fortune on it. And he decided in 1928, I don't know, he kind of wanted to retire. He sold his stock. So when the stock market crashed, he was worth the current equivalent of $340 million. And he decided he would go sailing. So he was very part of the America's Club, and Bunny learned to sail. Bunny went to Foxcroft. She loved to ride, so that was a big part of her life, portrait done of her. And then I think the next one, she met this very dashing young man, Stacy Lloyd, Princeton graduate. No, this is Lily, her sister, the beautiful sister. And you can see why she would feel a little bit insecure next to gorgeous Lily. Bunny is a young debutante. This is Carter Hall. Her father began to research his Virginia ancestors, and he bought this enormous place, Carter Hall, which was near Foxcroft. And Bunny right after she graduated from high school, because she wouldn't go to college, she helped her father restore this place. Now that's Stacy Lloyd, her first husband, and that's their son, who was a blue baby born with his umbilical cord wrapped around his neck. They called him Tuffy, and he became Tough Baby, and he became Tuffy the rest of his life. And gorgeous wedding thing. Paul Mellon. Paul Mellon with his first wife, Mary. You probably know who Andrew Mellon was. His father was Treasury Secretary for 3 presidents. Mellon Bank, Mellon Coal, Mellon everything. Paul's parents had a really terrible divorce when he was 4. There were these heartbreaking front page pictures of Paul grasping his mother's hand, and his father got mostly primary custody. He could be a totally charming man, but he also spent his entire life in therapy and analysis with people like Anna Freud, and Jung. He went for the best. But he was he could be wonderful, but he was also very repressed and complicated. And this is wife number 1. Now, Bunny and Stacy got to know Paul Mellon and his wife through the whole Virginia horse country. The men rode together. They were really good friends. During World War II, both men went to London, and they were roommates together. Bunny's husband was writing all these letters back to Bunny about Paul Mellon's affairs in London. She began to worry whether was her husband a very good-looking man, as he was having affairs too. So the marriages were troubled. When the men came back from the war, both of them, Paul wrote in his autobiography that, he felt estranged from his wife. Bunny was very worried. Paul's wife, Mary, was allergic to horses, but she wanted to be part of her husband's life, and writing was his life. And one day they were writing, and she had a fatal asthma attack and died. And at that point, they had 2 little kids. Bunny and her husband were solicitous. Bunny was very solicitous. Paul was then the 5th richest man in America, and he was in a daze, and he didn't know what to do with these kids, and her marriage seemed to be failing, and she made herself indispensable. I've always believed that she never stopped loving her husband, Stacy, and later in life they had a rapprochement. But she divorced Stacy to marry Paul, and suddenly she had a very different life. And this is Oak Spring, part of more of her sketches. This unbelievably beautiful place. This is Bunny with the 4 kids in the black dress on the, I guess it would be on the, that's Mary Mellon, Bunny's son Tuffy, Bunny, and Tim Mellon, and Bunny's daughter Eliza. Elizabeth asked me whether the kids were wealthy, and Tim and Kathy Mellon inherited Mellon money. If any of you want to look up Tim, he gave gazillions to Donald Trump. So they were very wealthy. Bunny's kids didn't suffer, but they didn't have that kind of money. Bunny and Paul is a later picture in life, but by their plane. Now, some of you may know that Sotheby's auctioned off her possessions, and I've got some pictures which will show you just how well she lived. Pretty fabulous. I have to say, as a writer, spending time here is really a privilege. Mellon Art Collection. Andrew Mellon created the National Gallery of Art. Bunny and Paul. It's almost hard to imagine how much art they collected. If they went to a gallery and they saw 5 paintings, they'd buy them all. I mean, they collected and collected and collected. And then they stuck this very famous Van Gogh on top of their fireplace, and they were having fires. Any art conservator was losing their mind. But Bunny was very involved in Paul's art collection choice and also in his philanthropy. Bunny had, another one of these quiet forces for civil rights. She helped her husband direct a lot of money to historical black colleges. She also very involved in conservation and ecology. Again, she became famous for her topiary trees. More of the famous Rothkos that sold for a gazillion dollars. The jewelry, oh my God. Elizabeth was saying she wished she had gone to the auction. Oh. The auction was an extraordinary experience because 6 floors of stuff. And my husband and I went, early on, and we thought, oh, there's a really nice hooked rug. We'd like that it's like $500. We could afford that. $5,000. My favorite, Bunny had this very close friend, Brian Huffman, as a decorator. They talked every night for 10 years, and he gave her these inexpensive gifts. And I was sitting with him during the auction, and there was a wire sculpture of a bunny, which it had one of these very fancy auction house, pre-da-da-da. He said, I got that at a decorator's thing for $200. So we were trying to guess, how much could this thing sell for? $40,000. And I asked the couple why, and they said, it was Bunny's bunny. We had to have it. I mean, she was so famous for her. All right, this is the famous weekend that JFK asked Bunny to design the Rose Garden. The pictures were taken by Katharine Graham, Washington Post publisher, and her family, who was also at that famous lunch. The Rose Garden. There was a famous incident that happened when they were digging up the Rose Garden, which is they cut the cord for the Strategic Arms Command, and suddenly they put the whole country on war alert for like an hour until they figured it out. But there's a really touching note that JFK wrote to Bunny saying that during the Cuban Missile Crisis, that the one place he found relief was walking around the White House Rose Garden. Bunny and Jackie at a Noel Coward show. If you look at the two of them, because that's kind of how they always look. Bunny would always be sort of 2 steps behind her, and Jackie would be the person everybody wanted to see. And then Bunny, alas, organizing the flowers for Robert Kennedy's, funeral. Bunny and Jackie, friends till the end of their life. Bunny even did the flowers for Jackie's funeral. She was with her in the last hours before she died. Bunny and this amazing alley of flowers down at her, plants at her place in Virginia. Bunny had an amazing eye, but she was also obsessive about perfectionism. Elizabeth and I were talking about, you could be driven mad by this. She had a whole pool put in her place in Antigua, and then she decided the shallow end should be where the deep end was, and she had them redig it up. The Gardners learned that if she was flying into Cape Cod for the weekend, they should leave the prettiest flowers, prettiest leaves on the ground. They shouldn't rake them up because she wanted nature. It was just kind of crazy. On the other hand, she always liked to mix things that were a little bit perfect and a little bit imperfect to make people feel almost more at home. All right, the woman on the right is Dorcas Hardin. Ran a dress shop in Georgetown and was Paul Mellon's girlfriend for 30 years. And that was very painful for Bunny. And she made the decision, she knew, she was aware. Dorcas was partially deaf. And when Paul Mellon would come home, Bunny would say, "You don't have to yell now, you're home." But Bunny decided that she would wait Dorcas out. And she was so gracious that after Paul Mellon died, she invited Dorcas and Dorcas's children to the funeral. Dorcas didn't come, but her children did go. Givenchy, I had the great pleasure of speaking to on the phone, and he was really Bunny's closest friend. He died a number of years ago. Bunny was really in love with him, and he was gay, and I think that was very, she kept diaries, and it was almost painful to read just how much she was in love with him. But they talked all the time. He traveled with her, and they were very close. So she didn't get one part of the relationship, but she got a lot of fulfillment out of the other.
Did Balenciaga introduce them? Is that
yes,
who?
Yeah.
Right. So
she was dressed by Balenciaga, and then when he was
her gardening clothes were designed by Balenciaga.
I only later discovered after it was gone that they gave all of her clothes to Housing Works in New York.
Oh my God.
I would have, yes. I'm looking at somebody's face. Yeah, we could have all gone and bought Bunny's hats and clothes. And this is Bunny in Antigua, a place she really adored. Tory Burch, that's who I was trying to remember. Tory Burch bought the Antigua place, and I was invited. When you write about wealthy people, you get amazing invitations. I was invited to the club in Antigua. They even paid my husband's bar bill, which was really impressive, in flying us in. But Tory Burch invited us to what had been Bunny's house, and drove us around and showed us how she had restored it. And that's part of, and one or two more. This is the library that Bunny built for her collection of rare gardening books, and it's really gorgeous and unusual. This is when the National Gallery opened. That's I.M. Pei who designed it, another person and his wife that became very close to Bunny and Paul. And I love this photo because they had a long marriage, and it was complicated and difficult, and they stayed together. And Paul, there was a birthday party for Paul like a year before he died, and he turned to his nurse, Nancy Collins, who became Bunny's nurse, and said, "I'm glad I stayed with Bunny." So, and this is her daughter, Eliza, and her grandson, Thomas, at the top, her son, Tuffy, in the middle at the bottom in the blue. The great tragedy of Bunny's life was that her daughter, Eliza, was hit by a truck crossing the street in Manhattan, and then spent 8 years basically unable to speak. Bunny built a special house for her. She had round-the-clock, she was with her every day, but 8 long years of living with an invalid who could not communicate. So, and that's the library from a farther distance. Back to you, Elizabeth.
Absolutely.
What haven't we talked about? You'd
Oh
like
my
to
gosh,
talk
there's
about?
so much. I know, and I want to, because there's so much, and it's just so interesting, because she was so tender with her daughter. And she'd fly baskets of flowers to her friends on her private plane, just because they were fresh, and just was her love and her generosity was so immense. And then she could be cruel and cut people, because they sneezed wrong. So but I want to go back to so she divorces Stacey Lloyd, and she marries Paul Mellon, and she comes from. She's wealthy, she's very wealthy, but then...
Not the way she was wealthy
her
after
life,
she married Paul Mellon.
Yeah, and then her life, it just changes. And within that change also comes who she, suddenly starts meeting and being around. And I'd love to talk about when, the Queen and Prince Philip decide to come to America. And all these hostesses are salivating, to host them, and they choose Bunny and Paul. And will you walk us through that visit? Didn't she cover all of her flowers in little blankets to keep them?
As you remember, Queen Elizabeth loved horses. So the real bond between Queen Elizabeth and Paul Mellon was horses. So he had this whole formal, series of things to do in Washington, but he wanted to take a break. So Paul and Bunny invited him down. And Bunny was so obsessed with having the gardens be perfect that she, as Elizabeth said, she had them covered overnight so that the frost wouldn't get them. Her daughter Eliza, who was at boarding school, she was at Foxcroft, all the little girls lined up along the road, and Bunny was so excited that she got to meet the Queen's husband, and she did the, see you later, alligator, and he said, in a while, crocodile, and she just thought that was so cute that he remembered. And John Warner, the senator, now deceased, had been married to Mary Mellon's daughter, and he remembered that day and how Bunny, gave them a whole list of things they should and shouldn't do, and immediately the Queen began asking questions, and all the decorum flew up in the air. Many years later, when Diana and Prince Charles came to America, Bunny also arranged for them to come to her house and had, John Kennedy Jr. And Virginia Warner, and kind of a generational, magical, royalty and Virginia royalty.
And isn't it true that when Princess Diana visited, that her dining room wouldn't fit all of the people that she wanted or needed to invite? So she knocked the wall out of her dining room.
What was interesting is when I began...
I love her so much.
When I began to do family research, I discovered that her father had done the same thing when he was giving a big party for Bunny and her new husband at Carter Hall back in the early 30s. He too built a whole separate wing for the party, which he then destroyed. And so Bunny did the same thing. I mean, it's kind of... when my husband and I visited Oak Spring, one of the young women, Kimberly, was giving my husband a tour, and he said, "Oh, I can just imagine in the Civil War, the soldiers coming over that hill." And Kim said, "No, that hill didn't exist. Bunny put the hill there. She thought it would be more scenic." I mean, it's just kind of fascinating that, that she saw things that the rest of us don't see, but made it beautiful and comfortable. I mean, I didn't feel like, it was a funny thing because I don't come from that kind of money. I didn't inherit it. I didn't marry it. But even on the phone and all the people, she really wanted people to enjoy and feel comfortable around her. She wasn't trying to she wasn't a snob in a weird way. She admired people who were good at what they did. So if you were an amazing landscape gardener, you'd been invited over, you were a wonderful curator. She wanted to spend time with people. She was more interested in spending time with those kind of folks than other, very wealthy Virginia horse country types.
And I know even with the Rose Garden, she was the one who went around the kind of parks in Washington and found somebody she thought was suitable, but also changed his life and brought him into her fold. And I agree with you. The sense you get from this is that she was really talented. She really was a worker, and she loved being around and picking people who she thought also had that that standard of talent, Balenciaga or Schlumberger, Givenchy, but people who put together her parties, they were artists, and visionaries in their own right. And I think she was one of those people that really handpicked and saw the magic in others. And she didn't care where you came from, as long as you kind of were super talented and kind of had that same aesthetic. And in terms of her aesthetic, I love what you said, that she wanted people to feel welcome. And there's this really beautiful, she has a chair, right? In kind of most of her houses, when you walk into the entrance, there's always a kind of faded and scruffy chair by the entrance, because she said, everybody has a chair like that in their home. So when people walk in and there's like the Renoir and the Van Gogh, that this chair will make everybody feel comfortable. But she also would have apples strewn, kept on the ground, because that imperfection was perfect for her, right? I mean, there were real touches that were so Bunny.
She was really in love with nature. She would get up early in the morning and she would go out and prune the trees. And the gardeners would see all these little clippings. And there was something about being outdoors. She wrote, I was on Martha's Vineyard, but I had just begun researching the book. And I got a call from her grandson, Thomas, who was on Cape Cod. And he said, I've just found all of this stuff, that I think would be useful to you. Why don't I sail over and bring you this stuff? Okay. I'm not complaining. He shows up with this enormous plastic tub filled with all of the letters that Bunny had written to her daughter Eliza. And for whatever reason, they had been stored there. And so I got to read these gorgeous letters that were really all about Bunny's love for nature, that she would just describe. It's funny because you start to think about, she could have been a Martha Stewart. She could have been if she'd had a different life or been born in a different era. One of the things I began doing for the book, and when I became aware of her love of nature, now I live on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, but I would look every day at, when does the sun set? And I would make a point of stopping work, and I would either go up on our roof deck or look out the window, and it was like Bunny's little gift to me. I mean, I felt like when I walked to the subway on 86 and Broadway, there are plants and flowers in the Meridian, and I would really try to say, let's just stop and look at the plants. It's, cars are whizzing by, but so I felt like she gave me that little gift in a funny way that I was never going to be able to design. I can't afford Givenchy. The book did well, but not that well. But, for all these books I've done, you take a little bit about, the people that you've written about. I mean, I used to do a lot of profiles, and I profiled Paloma Picasso. And her father had cut her off at a very young age, and she would go and visit museums to look at her father's work. And she had a sculpture that her father had done of her mother pregnant. And when I was in her apartment, she was rubbing the belly of the... So whenever I see Picasso's now, I think of that relationship and the poignancy. And with Bunny, what's been unusual also is I've stayed in touch with a number of people who I got to know during the book. Her lawyer, Alex Forger, is over 100 now. He used to joke that he and Bunny were racing for the grave together because he continued to handle her work. He's in assisted living now, but I talked to him about, I have another possible book project, so I called him and we had a very long chat. I'm in touch with Thomas Lloyd, her grandson. It's kind of nice that you develop these relationships with people. You become, unwittingly, a little bit of a form of therapist. What was it like? How did you feel? What did you know? So they, when the book came out, Thomas Lloyd and his wife gave me a party at the Sulgrave Club in honor of the book. Tim Mellon came, and Tim Mellon, her stepson, wouldn't give me an interview for the book, but I was very relieved when he said to me, "You got it right." One of the funnier stories he told, when you read somebody's will, there are often like quirky little things in it. So in her will, she left him this beautiful porcelain cabbage. What was that about? And if you went to her auction, there were like rows and rows of all that beautiful porcelain, this, that, and the other. So I asked him, what was that about? And he said, this was it was the reception right after her death, but the will had already become public. And he said, well, when we were growing up, she had one of these porcelain cabbages in the middle of the table, and she always said, oh, don't, be careful of the cabbage. And so as a result, he said, us 4 kids were always throwing food across it and trying to annoy her and whatever. And then Tim's ex-wife told me that at one point, he was so angry at Bunny for something, she'd given him a cabbage, that he, tossed it, broke it up in pieces. So Bunny's final comment was to give him another one, which I thought was hilarious. I don't know what he did with it, but he has it.
I know that we want to do a little bit of
Q&A. Sure.
Q&A. But before we do, just will you quickly touch upon, and you said she was so generous and but very thoughtful. It wasn't always about giving somebody something extravagant, even though.
Oh, I know what story you're talking about.
But even with Givenchy, kind of a little package being flown across to Paris, and it was a stone she'd found on the beach that she just thought he had to have. So and at the same time would cut people. And would never explain to them, and would have had them in her life for years, and flown them on her planes, and included them in her most private moments, and then dropped them like that. What do you think that was?
I'm not a shrink, although I've spent a lot of time in therapy. And I think she, going back to her, I always go back to people's childhoods. I think she really was so hurt, feeling that her brother was her mother's favorite, her sister was her father's favorite, that she wasn't anybody's favorite. And I think it sort of created a lot of a chip on her shoulder, of a feeling that, do people really care about me? And then, particularly after she married Paul Mellon, as you know, when somebody's incredibly rich, there's the whole issue, do people love me for myself or for what I can do for them? So anytime she felt that people were, were even thinking about, using her name or doing whatever, she would cut them off. It was almost like that whole thing where you cut off somebody before they hurt you. I'm going to be the first one. It was very sad in many ways. The story Elizabeth was referring to, there's a woman named Dita Blair, well-known philanthropist in New York, and Dita was going over to Paris, and she also was dressed by Givenchy. And Bunny called her to say, I hear you're going, could you bring him a little package? And she said, sure. And she said, Bunny, arranged for a car to meet me at the airport in Paris, and she wanted to make sure that, Givenchy got his gift. She said, so a couple days later, when I was having a meal with Givenchy, I said, well, what was in the package? And it literally was a stone that Bunny had found on the beach that she thought was absolutely perfect. And I said, was Givenchy disappointed? No, it was a gift from Bunny. I mean, she also had given him more elaborate things. One of the things that I could not, when Paul Mellon died, he left Bunny $110 million plus, her estate in Oak Spring, estates in Antigua, Martha's Vineyard, Cape Cod, townhouse in New York. So, all right, I just want to see a show of hands. If any of you had $110 million, do you think it would keep you going for the rest of your life? 5 years. She ran through it all. She had 200 employees. She didn't, do you really need 5 laundresses for one woman?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and so she then borrowed, she began to sell the real estate. Cut back? No, we're not cutting back, And she borrowed against her Rothkos, and the Rothkos, hundreds of millions of dollars at auction. But her grandson was kind of just rolling his eyes. Bunny left most of her money to a foundation that runs Oak Spring, which is also, she did not leave a ton of money to her grandchildren. She felt that I think she was felt that her son had not had a very good life because he didn't have ambition. Maybe he always had money that made him comfortable. He didn't work hard. And I think she didn't want to put that on her. I mean, they're fine, but they're not fine.
I think actually we have run out of time, but I think go buy the book and then you can ask Meryl any questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you.